Hello, I'm Chris Maxwell from Erickson Institute, and I'm really Sam Meisels today. So those of you who know Sam know I don't look at all like him, but he does send his regards. Just really quickly, I was so struck by how my thinking went where yours did, Mary Lou. As I was listening to the panel, just thought there were so many parallels between those big questions that are out there for professional development, which is my current world at Erickson, in teacher education within higher education, which is my former life, like who are the coaches, who are the faculty or the people who are providing the teacher education, the teaching within higher education. We heard so much about the conditions, kind of the context within which the PD may be more or less effective this morning, and then I'm thinking about how do we set the context for the clinical experiences for student teachers and what makes those more or less successful. And then the breadth issue to me is huge, as my current world is pre-kindergarten through grade 3, and as I heard about Jacqueline endorsing our need to support that, but yet how do we really prepare teachers who, not knowing what age level they're going to teach when they go out, really have the depth of knowledge and skill that they need to cover those. So lots of parallels. But we also have lots of questions that came from the audience. You did your jobs well. I think the first is targeted toward really anybody on the panel who chooses to answer. From a policy perspective, should the different degrees, going back to the data on variability among people who have 2 versus 4, other types of higher ed experiences, should these different degrees indicate what from a policy perspective in terms of teacher training or quality? And again, stated differently both from this individual and others in other questions, what should we expect of a teacher with an AA degree compared to a BA degree? Is more education necessarily better or a higher policy priority? So a lot embedded in that. But similarly, what might our goals be for teachers with a 2-year degree as compared to a 4-year degree? Who would like to take a stab at some of those thorny questions?
I think other people can get into the depth of this more, but I do think for the few people who may not have been constantly involved in these discussions, the fact that as Kathy's data and national data about the association between degrees and outcomes, is really depressing because it suggests that there isn't a whole lot of sort of value added. But, I think what many of us have come to believe, and I don't think this is just wishful thinking, that this probably says more about the content of programs than, whoever would have thought that just having a couple of letters after your name or different letters would result in more competencies. So I just think that's important to keep in mind, that we're looking at a system that frankly is not of extremely high quality across the board to start with. So,
Kathy?
How many of you are from states where you have core competencies for early childhood? A lot of you, I think. Kansas and Missouri actually did a bi-state core competencies, and within each competency, it talks about at what level the person is and what competencies they need, including the 2-year, 4-year, and so forth. I think sometimes we found that our higher ed faculty really wasn't aware of it because it wasn't done within the higher ed context very much. But to start thinking and pushing those and looking at them and the next revision be a part of them and so forth, I think is really important because that really distinguishes what the beginner needs and competencies and so forth, the 2-year, et cetera.
Well, I would also just caution us to, when we look at these things about degrees, that we often don't have enough information about the degree to really make a judgment about that. But I also think, when you show the slides about the people had, the Eckers were like in the 2s and 3s. If you're working in a program that it's getting 2s and 3s and an Eckers, I don't know how much school you've had or whatever you've been doing. It's really hard to do anything very good in a program that's that low. So I think we really do have to think about the context in which people are working, and a lot of the debate about the the degree versus not the degree has sort of left out both one side on the content and the other side on the context. And, I would just also say that, we also have to remember that it's because we have so few resources in early childhood, the idea that we're questioning whether or not teachers need education is sort of always sort of irritating to me, because there's good lawyers and bad lawyers, and they all went, even if they went to law school, and there's good doctors and bad doctors. So I think that we're sort of expecting something, I think, from the education around early childhood teachers that's in some ways different than we're expecting that education for other people in the society, and I would just have us ponder that.
And we have so many of our decisions, policy decisions, I think, are made on self-reported levels of education and so forth. And in other talks, I've given examples, like in our registry, we found that somebody says, oh yeah, I have an AA degree, and in fact they have a CDA, the word associates,
Right.
and whether they are getting confused or whether they really think they do, or whether,
Right.
it's a lie in some cases, we really don't know. But even more interestingly to me is when we have research and we say, they have a 1-year degree, or they have some college, they have 2-year, they have 4-year, and then we make policy decisions based on those data. We found in Missouri our some college people with verified training had from 3 hours, and now think of this, if you were the parent of the child who had 167 hours and no degree, so you have some college, well, from 3 credits to 167 credits is pretty amazing, but yet that's the best data we have, and that's the category we use. So we know less than we know less. I started saying we know less than we know. Now that's pretty profound, I know, than we think we know.
And I'll just add, from a research perspective, we have to remember that these are individuals, and that at least in our 4-year program, a lot already have a 2-year degree, and they've articulated to 4 years. So is it 2-year versus 4-year, or 4-year on top of 2-year? The other thing that I would add is, are we looking at the right things to make some qualitative distinctions between the programs? As we saw, they're focusing on different things. So are our measures really matching up what it is that either 2-year or 4-year institution is trying to achieve with a teacher? The ERS, a lot of it's health and safety. Does a 4-year degree focus on health and safety? Maybe not. But theory and practice, maybe so. So are we measuring what we need to be measuring as we make some of these comparisons?
Great. There was also a lot of interest around Kathy's talking about registries, so kind of interrelated questions here. How do we get more states involved? How well, if at all, are these registries linked to other state databases about children in classrooms? And is there a way to have a more mutually supportive relationship between higher ed and registries?
And in addition, higher ed, state departments of ed and registries, because we have certified or degreed teachers who are in our pre-K programs or early childhood special ed who have to be in the certification program at the Department of Ed, and then we want them in the registry, and so we're trying to figure out where that person will only have to be there once and how we can get the information everywhere. And I wanted to make sure, Marcy pointed out, I wanted to make sure in those 9 states, it's not that every person in the workforce is in the registries. It varies considerably. In Wisconsin, it's a requirement for certain parts of people. I know in Missouri, we're at 35 or 40% of our early childhood and school-age workforce, so it's not complete, but it's certainly more than we ever knew before. And I think that's a good thing. And I forgot the rest of the questions.
There are kind of multiple overlapping. How to get more states involved? Are they linked to other state databases? And the idea of, is there a way to have a mutually beneficial relationship between registries and higher education?
And there are 33 states that have registries, and I have a list if you're interested to see if you're one of them. And except for those 9, they really need to go through that system to show that their data are being collected in a valid way and like really a good system, so we can start depending on them more for answering questions and how to get more people in it. And some state departments are requiring, if you get any state monies from social services, education, and so forth, then your workforce has to be in the registry. And as we move in that direction, we'll have more and better data, if you will. And I think I talked about the one about hooking together
Mhm.
the systems and so forth. And I did bring some additional information I'd be happy to share with anyone.
Okay, time for one last question. Okay, this came from someone who was feeling the length of the day. Where do we start with changing anything in higher education programs? And it's, I guess, a chance for each person on the panel, drawing from your own research, but also perhaps extrapolating from research on professional development, where you might think the most powerful starting point for making changes in higher education toward the end of higher quality practices.
I don't know. At the end of the day. One thing I just would say is that early childhood, people who teach early childhood in institutions of higher education are like early childhood people everywhere. They're sort of at the bottom of the barrel in their institution. So I think we find sometimes around reaching out to early childhood teacher education, people feel very sort of beleaguered already. So I don't really have an answer to that, but just would say that I think it's important, and when we talk about changing higher ed, we figure out ways to bring early childhood higher ed people into that conversation in a way that doesn't, start sort of doesn't get the resistance going right off the bat. I'll say it that way. But I do think that there is something about state policy, and I think what Jacqueline alluded to this, I think in North Carolina, that's why I'm doing another study, in New Jersey, when Abbott came through, there was an expectation for higher education to change what they were doing, and there were resources, right, Jacqueline, that allowed to help them do some of that. So that got people being willing to change, and we know in California when we thought we might get a preschool initiative, which we didn't get, but in those few months before it got defeated, boy, we got higher ed to the table in ways you would never have expected, because people thought there were going to be new rules and regulations, and so people were really willing to think about changing what they do. So I think it's a dialectical thing. You have to, you can't just say change, but I think it is some balance between changing your policies and creating some kind of incentives that help people do it. And that's the other thing. If you're asking people to revamp courses and do that kind of thing, that's hard for people to do if they don't have some resources and help to do that.
Mary Lou?
Yeah, kind of building on that, is I'm thinking that we need to approach this on several fronts, and I'm not sure if this is simultaneous or sequential. I mean, to me, the hardest thing seems to be working kind of on the systems level and changing the often very entrenched higher education policies and so on. I think on the faculty level, not changing your whole program, but I think some research that I and others have done suggests that despite big workloads and so on, faculty in early childhood programs are very eager for professional development and to improve and enhance what you're doing, because they care very deeply about and often come from the same world that their students come from. They care about preparing people to do it's not just theory to them. This is real. And I think to the extent in a simple, cost-effective way we can, in the interim while all these big policy issues are getting sorted out, if we can put into the hands of faculty simple, practical resources, modules, we have things, we have examples of these kinds of things. I've been working on developing a prototype of kind of an online kind of clearinghouse web resource for faculty. I mean, I think if we can think together about some of those kinds of things, not as the answer to the larger systems issue, but as kind of a both and, that might be a way to get started as well.
Okay, Kathy?
This will be controversial, I'm sure, as some degree programs are moving more narrow as compared to expanded. In Missouri, we've had the birth to third grade. That's 9 years of development for quite a few years now. And when we got the faculty together, not last year, one university thought they were really doing a fair job for infants and toddlers. Those that thought they were doing a good job in first grade didn't think they were doing so well with how to work with teach babies, and vice versa. And so they're actually considering two, birth through pre-K and pre-K, so the 3 to 5s
Right.
overlap, pre-K through third grade, realizing that the pre-K through third grade needs to understand the development of infants and toddlers, but they won't have
Right.
time for so much coursework or so many practica, student teaching, etc., just thinking that it might be too much. And when I did a little math here, I thought, well, that would be the same as certifying people from 4th through 12th grade. 9 years. And we wouldn't even consider that, I don't think. So is it because we just kind of tacked on the babies, but now we know they're really more important than they were? So we're considering, Missouri's actually considering taking the birth to third and making 2.
Karen or Catherine?
I
Changes?
think I would just add to it that we be very cautious and that we don't do in higher ed what we've done to classrooms of we keep changing things and changing things. We work on a little piece and we change. And so that we do keep in mind the larger system. We can't address it all at the same time, but a change in one aspect and what that influence is in the next system. So that we have the big picture and we're communicating and we're not just keep rolling out these changes that ultimately don't have the influence we hope they have.
So I think I would echo Kathy in terms of what I think of as focus. Because right now higher ed is asked to do lots of different things, lots of different ages, but if you think about it, we're also preparing students for lots of different places. So can we do it all, I would ask. The second thing that I would suggest is make a stronger connection between higher ed and in-service professional development. I sit on a lot of policy-oriented things in my state and other states, and I'm usually there because I'm wearing another hat, not because I'm higher ed. And I'm looking around going, where are the higher ed folks? And what could we being higher ed, learn from just being at the table where professional development is being discussed? So making a closer connection between higher ed and, for lack of the real world is what you might call it in some places, but the professional development that's going on out in the field, because I think both would benefit.
Okay, I think that concludes.